A judge publicly mocked a royal guard for reading a law book during his shift, humiliating him in front of tourists. But when he ordered the silent guard to appear in court, the judge's smug smile vanished as he discovered he'd just challenged a legal genius. Here's what happened. But before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow at this very same time we're dropping another powerful Royal Guard story that you won't want to miss. The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of St. James's Palace as Sergeant Thomas Blackwell stood at his post, the weight of tradition evident in his ramrod-straight posture. Grey clouds hung heavy in the London sky, promising rain that would test the resilience of the guardsmen on duty. Blackwell remained motionless, his scarlet tunic a vivid splash of colour against the weathered sandstone walls, his bearskin cap adding another foot to his already impressive height. Small droplets began to fall, speckling the pristine uniform that Blackwell had spent hours preparing before dawn. 7 years in the King's Guard had taught him that discomfort was irrelevant to duty. What the onlookers couldn't know was that Sergeant Blackwell represented something of an anomaly among the ranks of the King's Guard. The son of a literature professor and a research chemist, he was the first in his family to pursue military service rather than academia. Before donning the scarlet tunic, he had served 4 years in diplomatic protection, guarding British officials in embassies abroad. A commotion at the edge of the gathering drew momentary glances from the tourists. A cluster of men in expensive suits approached, led by a figure whose very stance suggested someone accustomed to deference. Judge Martin Hargrove moved with the confidence of a man who saw the world as his personal courtroom, his entourage of legal assistants trailing behind like a jury instructed to follow his lead. At 58, Hargrove cut an imposing figure. Over 6 feet tall with silver-streaked dark hair, perfectly coiffed despite the dampening air. His bespoke suit bore the subtle sheen of fabric that cost more than most people earned in a month. A gold watch glinted at his wrist as he gestured expansively toward the palace. "The guards," he announced loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "are a perfect example of Britain clinging to outdated pageantry rather than practical function. Did you know they began as actual combat soldiers under Charles the Saint? Now they're essentially ceremonial puppets, trained to stand still and look decorative." Recently appointed to the High Court, after years of climbing the judicial ladder, Hargrove had developed a reputation for harsh sentences and intellectual arrogance. His rulings were considered brilliant, but delivered with a condescension that left even victorious barristers feeling somehow diminished. "I'd wager it takes remarkable patience," Hargrove remarked to no one in particular, now standing directly across from Blackwell, "to stand there hour after hour without intellectual stimulation. Rather like watching paint dry, but being the paint." His companions chuckled obligingly at the joke, their laughter cutting through the respectful murmurs of other visitors. The judge leaned forward, resting his hands on the barrier that separated him from the guard. With each passing minute, his posture became more intrusive until he was leaning well over the designated line, his umbrella now partially extending into the restricted space. "Sir," a palace security officer approached with professional courtesy, "I need to ask you to step back behind the barrier. For security reasons, we maintain a clear zone around all guard positions." Hargrove turned to the officer, his expression shifting from amusement to indignation with practiced ease. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, the question carrying the weight of a man accustomed to recognition opening doors. "Regardless of who you are, sir, the rules apply equally to all visitors," the security officer replied evenly. "I am Judge Martin Hargrove of the High Court," he declared, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "I've sentenced men for genuine security violations. This," he gestured toward the barrier with clear disdain, "is merely crowd control dressed up as security protocol." "Nevertheless, sir, I must insist." "Very well," Hargrove interrupted, taking half a step back but maintaining his position of conversational dominance. "Let me demonstrate something to you all," the judge announced to his entourage. "Watch as I conduct a little experiment in human response." He turned to face Sergeant Blackwell directly, adopting what his colleagues recognized as his courtroom interrogation posture. "Guard," he began, his tone mockingly formal, "would you say your role here serves an actual security function, or is it primarily a tourist attraction?" Blackwell remained perfectly motionless, his gaze fixed forward as regulations demanded. "No opinion on the matter? Perhaps you're not permitted independent thought while on duty," Hargrove continued. "Let me try something simpler. What qualifications were required for your position? Physical stamina, ability to withstand boredom, skill at remaining decorative." Several tourists had stopped to watch the uncomfortable scene unfold, their expressions ranging from embarrassment to indignation on the guard's behalf. An elderly woman shook her head disapprovingly. "Nothing to say? Not even a twitch of acknowledgement?" Hargrove pressed, his smile growing sharper. "Perhaps I was mistaken about the physical stamina requirement. Clearly the primary qualification is the ability to impersonate a statue." Throughout this barrage, Blackwell maintained his forward gaze, his disciplined bearing betraying nothing of the thoughts behind his impassive expression. His training had prepared him for far worse than verbal provocation. The rain had intensified, driving most casual observers away, but Judge Hargrove seemed energized rather than deterred by the deteriorating conditions. Each raindrop that spattered against his umbrella seemed to fuel his sense of superiority, as if the weather itself were providing a backdrop for his performance. One of his junior associates, a young man named Timothy, who had only recently completed his legal training, hung back from the group. His discomfort with the judge's behavior was increasingly evident in his posture and expression. Timothy had initially been honored when offered a position with the renowned jurist, but moments like this, watching Hargrove belittle others to elevate himself, made him question his career choice. A middle-aged woman with an Australian accent who had been watching the scene with increasing disapproval finally spoke to the security officer. "Is this sort of behavior common?" "Where I'm from, we're taught to respect these guards, not harass them." "It's not common, ma'am," the officer replied quietly. "Most visitors understand the tradition and respect it." "Well, someone should remind His Honour that respect is a two-way street," she commented, loud enough for several nearby tourists to nod in agreement. Hargrove's attention, momentarily diverted by his self-congratulatory summation, returned to Sergeant Blackwell with renewed focus. His eyes narrowed as he noticed something he had previously overlooked. "What's this?" he asked, his voice sharpening with interest. "Our statuesque friend appears to have something in his pocket." Indeed, the outline of a small rectangular object was barely visible in the breast pocket of Blackwell's tunic. "Tell me, guard, what sort of picture book do they allow you to carry? Something to keep you entertained during those long hours of immobility?" The mockery in his tone was unmistakable. When Blackwell maintained his disciplined silence, the judge's expression hardened from amusement to something closer to annoyance. Without warning, he reached across the barrier and plucked the small volume from Blackwell's pocket with deft fingers. The gesture was so unexpected and inappropriate that even Hargrove's entourage gasped. One of them started to object, but fell silent as the judge examined his prize. "Now let's see what keeps our sentinel occupied during his—" Hargrove's voice cut off abruptly as he read the title of the book he now held. "Contemporary Applications of Constitutional Law in Modern Jurisprudence," he read aloud, his tone shifting from mockery to disbelief. He flipped the book open, revealing dense legal text with highlighted passages and careful annotations in the margins. "A rather ambitious prop for a ceremonial guard," he declared, closing the book with a sharp snap. "I wonder, did they provide this to you to make tourists believe the King's Guard consists of scholar soldiers rather than men selected primarily for their height and ability to stand still?" The security officer, who had intervened earlier, returned quickly, his expression concerned. "Sir, I must ask you to return the guardsman's personal property and step back behind the barrier immediately." With poor grace, Hargrove handed the book to the security officer rather than returning it directly to Blackwell. "This matter isn't concluded," he declared. "In fact, I think it deserves further examination in a more formal setting." He reached into his jacket and produced an embossed card, which he handed to the security officer. "Sergeant Blackwell is hereby summoned to appear in my courtroom tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Westminster Magistrates Court, Courtroom 3. Hargrove's tone carried the full weight of his judicial authority. He will explain this theatrical prop and his apparent contempt for honest inquiry. "On what grounds could you possibly—" the security officer began. "Contempt of court," Hargrove interrupted. "His silence when directly addressed by a high court judge constitutes disrespect to the judicial system. His carrying of legal texts appears to be a deliberate misrepresentation of his role and qualifications. Both matters warrant formal examination." Westminster Magistrates Court bustled with its usual morning activity the following day. Barristers in black robes hurrying between courtrooms, clerks carrying stacks of files, defendants waiting nervously with their solicitors. The arrival of Sergeant Thomas Blackwell caused this familiar rhythm to falter momentarily, conversations pausing mid-sentence as legal professionals turned to stare at the unexpected sight of a King's Guard in full ceremonial uniform navigating the courthouse corridors. Blackwell moved with military precision, his scarlet tunic and bearskin cap creating a startling contrast against the subdued colours of the legal environment. Despite the attention, his bearing remained impeccable. Shoulders squared, chin up, steps measured and confident. "Is that actually a royal guard?" a junior solicitor whispered to her colleague. "Full dress uniform too," the older lawyer confirmed, watching Blackwell pass. "Must be Hargrove's 10 o'clock. He's been talking about it all morning in the judge's lounge." The court clerk looked up in surprise as Blackwell approached her desk. "Sergeant Thomas Blackwell, reporting as directed," he stated simply, his voice carrying the crisp precision of his military bearing. "Are you represented by counsel, Sergeant?" she asked, noting he stood alone. "That won't be necessary," Blackwell replied, with quiet confidence that left the clerk momentarily nonplussed. "Judge Hargrove can be rather formidable," she cautioned, lowering her voice slightly. "Thank you for your concern," Blackwell responded with a slight nod of acknowledgement. Judge Hargrove entered, his black robes flowing behind him as he strode to the bench. "All rise," called the bailiff, and the assembled crowd stood as Hargrove took his seat. "The court calls the matter of judicial inquiry regarding Sergeant Thomas Blackwell of the King's Guard," he announced, his voice carrying the practiced projection of decades on the bench. "This proceeding concerns potentially contemptuous behaviour toward a judicial officer and possible misrepresentation of qualifications." Legal professionals exchanged puzzled glances. The unusual nature of the proceeding, lacking a formal charging document, prosecutor, or typical procedural elements, was immediately apparent to those familiar with court protocol. A silver-haired barrister in the front row furrowed his brow in evident concern. "For the record," Hargrove continued, "yesterday while visiting the grounds of St. James's Palace, I observed the sergeant carrying materials suggesting expertise in areas outside his professional capacity. When questioned about this discrepancy, he displayed contempt through deliberate silence and refusal to acknowledge the inquiry of a High Court judge." Blackwell stood at perfect attention before the bench, his posture reminiscent of his guard post, though he had removed his bearskin cap and tucked it properly under his left arm in accordance with military protocol for indoor settings. "Do you understand why you have been summoned here today, Sergeant Blackwell?" Hargrove asked, his tone suggesting the question was merely a formality before moving to judgment. "I understand that Your Honour believes I have committed some form of contempt, sir," Blackwell replied evenly. "With all due respect, Your Honour," Blackwell began, when invited to respond to the charges, "the regulations governing the King's Guard explicitly prohibit engaging in conversation while on ceremonial duty. This rule exists for security reasons as well as ceremonial purposes. Security reasons? Hargrove repeated with evident skepticism. Are we to believe that answering a simple question might compromise royal security? That seems rather convenient. Royal Guard Standing Order 17, paragraph 3 states clearly that guards on ceremonial duty may only break silence in case of emergency or when officially relieved of post, Blackwell responded. Hargrove lifted the book from his bench, the same volume he had taken from Blackwell's pocket the previous day. Would you identify this item for the court? That is my personal copy of Contemporary Applications of Constitutional Law in Modern Jurisprudence by Professor James Harrington, Your Honour. And you expect this court to believe that you, a ceremonial guard, not only possess but actively study advanced legal theory during your duties? Hargrove's tone dripped with skepticism. This appears to be a rather transparent attempt to present yourself as something more than you are. Blackwell remained composed, despite the judge's increasingly aggressive tone. The regulations permit guards to carry a single small personal item during extended shifts, Your Honour. Many guards choose to carry photographs of family. I chose reading material related to my interests. The tradition dates back to the Victorian era, Blackwell added, his knowledge of military history evident. During the long ceremonial duties at Queen Victoria's court, guards were permitted small personal effects to maintain morale during extended shifts. The practice has continued as part of the regiment's heritage and has been formally codified in the modern standing orders that govern ceremonial duties. Several members of the legal profession in attendance nodded appreciatively at this historical context. One elderly barrister in the back row, who wore a regimental tie suggesting military service in his past, smiled slightly at the guard's composed explanation. Judge Hargrove's face registered a flicker of annoyance at being educated on historical matters in his own courtroom. I hardly think Victorian-era concessions to bored guardsmen constitute relevant precedent in a modern legal setting, he remarked dismissively. Your interests, Hargrove repeated mockingly. And we're to believe that constitutional law just happens to be light reading for someone whose professional obligations include standing motionless for hours. This strikes me as deliberate misrepresentation. The silver-haired barrister in the front row rose to his feet. Your Honour, if I might address the court regarding the procedural aspects of this matter. You have not been recognised, Sir William, Hargrove cut him off sharply. This is an inquiry under my authority, not a typical adversarial proceeding. With respect, Your Honour, even in judicial inquiries, basic principles of procedural fairness apply, Sir William persisted, his tone respectful but firm. The sergeant should be permitted to respond fully to these somewhat unusual accusations. Hargrove's expression darkened momentarily before he mastered himself. Very well. The court will hear the sergeant's response, though I expect it to be brief and to the point. Your Honour, Blackwell began, his voice clear and steady. Before addressing your specific questions, I believe it would be helpful to provide some context regarding my background and qualifications. He stood with perfect military bearing, his scarlet uniform immaculate under the courtroom lights. I am Sergeant Thomas Blackwell of the King's Guard, having served in that capacity for 7 years. Prior to that, I worked in diplomatic protection for 4 years. Yes, your military credentials are not in question, Hargrove interjected impatiently. If I may continue, Blackwell responded with unshaken composure. Before joining the military, I completed a law degree at Durham University, graduating with first-class honours. My specialisation was in constitutional and military law, with particular focus on the intersection of historical ceremonial functions and modern legal frameworks. A ripple of surprise moved through the courtroom. Hargrove's expression froze momentarily, his hand pausing mid-gesture as the implications of this statement registered. During my time at Durham, Blackwell continued in the same measured tone, I authored 3 papers on ceremonial military units and their legal standing in modern governance structures. One of these, Ceremonial Functions as Legal Continuity, the Role of Traditional Guards in Modern Constitutional Monarchies, was published in the British Journal of Constitutional Studies. The court reporter's fingers flew across her keyboard, capturing every word of this unexpected revelation. Several legal professionals were now leaning forward in their seats, their expressions transformed from puzzled amusement to genuine interest. Upon completion of my degree, I chose to enter military service rather than pursuing a traditional legal career. This decision was based on personal interest in the practical application of the constitutional principles I had studied. However, I have maintained my legal education through continuing professional development. Blackwell reached into his tunic and produced several folded documents, which he presented to the court clerk with military precision. These are my educational credentials, publication records, and current professional development certifications, which the court may wish to examine. These appear to be in order, Your Honour, the clerk confirmed after examining the documents. The sergeant's legal qualifications are quite extensive. Hargrove cleared his throat, shuffling the papers before him in what appeared to be an attempt to regain his composure. While these credentials are unexpected, he acknowledged stiffly, they do not address the matter of your silence when addressed by a judicial officer. As I began to explain earlier, Your Honour, Royal Guard Standing Order 17 explicitly prohibits guards on ceremonial duty from engaging in conversation except in emergencies. This is not merely a theatrical rule, but has practical security implications. Your Honour, Blackwell continued, I would now like to address the legal basis for today's proceeding, if the court permits. First, regarding the charge of contempt through silence, I would direct the court's attention to Regina v. Millington, 2007, where the High Court ruled that contempt requires a willful disregard for judicial authority in a setting where that authority properly extends. As I was on ceremonial duty at St. James's Palace, not in a courtroom or legal proceeding, the standard for contempt cannot apply. Blackwell cited the case from memory without reference to notes, his delivery suggesting the easy familiarity of someone thoroughly versed in the relevant precedents. Several barristers in the gallery exchanged impressed glances. Furthermore, in Judicial Conduct Guidelines, Section 14, Paragraph 3, it states explicitly that judges shall refrain from exercising judicial authority in informal or social settings. Your Honour's questions at the Palace, while perhaps offered in a personal capacity, could not constitute an official judicial inquiry requiring response. The methodical dismantling of Hargrove's position continued as Blackwell addressed each accusation with relevant case law and precise reasoning. The ceremonial uniform that had initially seemed out of place in the courtroom now carried a different significance, lending visual authority to Blackwell's knowledgeable presentation rather than detracting from it. Most significantly, Blackwell continued, the Judicial Ethics Code, Section 3, explicitly prohibits judges from using their judicial authority to settle personal disagreements or to address perceived slights outside the courtroom. This provision was specifically strengthened following Harrison v. Judicial Conduct Board, 2010, where a judge was sanctioned for initiating proceedings against an individual who had declined to engage with him at a social function. Hargrove's face had paled noticeably, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. The legal precision of Blackwell's response had transformed what the judge had clearly anticipated would be a simple exercise of authority into a potentially serious examination of his own judicial conduct. Before Hargrove could respond, the main courtroom doors opened to admit a distinguished woman in judicial robes, accompanied by the court administrator. Conversations immediately hushed as recognition spread through the gallery. Justice Eleanor Blackwood, Senior Judge of the District and Administrative Head of Westminster Magistrates' Court. Please remain seated, Justice Blackwood instructed, as people began to rise. Her expression was composed but serious as she approached the front of the courtroom. Judge Hargrove, I apologize for the interruption, but I've received multiple concerned communications regarding these proceedings. I've been monitoring the transcript as it was entered into the court system, Justice Blackwood continued. Given the nature of the concerns raised, I believe my intervention is appropriate at this stage. She turned briefly toward Blackwell, who stood at perfect attention. Sergeant, thank you for your patience during these irregular proceedings. Would you be seated for a moment while administrative matters are addressed? Justice Blackwood returned her attention to Hargrove. Judge Hargrove, the transcript reveals several serious procedural irregularities that cannot be overlooked. The initiation of contempt proceedings without proper documentation, the failure to recuse yourself from a matter in which you were personally involved, and the apparent use of judicial authority to address a personal grievance all raise significant concerns. Hargrove's face had flushed deeply, the stark contrast to his earlier confident demeanour evident to everyone in the courtroom. Justice Blackwood, I was merely seeking to address what I perceived as disrespect to judicial authority. The transcript suggests otherwise, she interrupted firmly. Your characterization of the sergeant's uniform as a costume and theatrical display, your removal of his personal property without permission at the palace, and your comments regarding his intellectual capacity all suggest a personal, rather than procedural concern. She gestured to the court administrator, who placed a folder before her. Additionally, I've reviewed Sergeant Blackwell's credentials as presented to the court. His legal qualifications are impeccable, his academic publications noteworthy, and his dual service as both ceremonial guard and regimental legal advisor is well documented. The administrator approached Hargrove, placing a document before him. This is a formal notice of administrative review regarding today's proceedings, Justice Blackwood explained. Given the serious nature of the procedural violations, I am exercising my authority as administrative head to intervene immediately, rather than allowing further continuation of an improper proceeding. She turned to address the court more broadly. Let the record show that all alleged charges or citations against Sergeant Thomas Blackwell are dismissed with prejudice. The record will further reflect that no valid contempt occurred, no misrepresentation was established, and no improper conduct by the sergeant has been demonstrated. Justice Blackwood returned her attention to Hargrove, her expression now stern. Judge Hargrove, you are directed to recuse yourself from any further involvement in this matter. Additionally, you will report to my chambers immediately following the conclusion of this session to discuss the significant ethical concerns raised by your conduct. Sergeant Blackwell, Justice Blackwood continued, on behalf of the court, I extend a formal apology for the inappropriate treatment you have experienced. Your professional responses to these irregular proceedings reflect credit on both your legal training and military discipline. Do you wish to make any statement for the record before these proceedings are formally concluded? She asked. Blackwell rose to his feet, his bearing impeccable. Only that I understand Judge Hargrove's genuine concern for maintaining respect for judicial authority, which is an important principle. While the approach in this instance may have been procedurally flawed, the underlying value of respecting our institutions, both judicial and military, is one I believe we all share. The magnanimity of his response was not lost on those present. Where many might have seized the opportunity for righteous vindication after such treatment, Blackwell chose instead to highlight common ground and shared values. It was a moment that spoke volumes about his character, more eloquent than any legal argument he had presented. Justice Blackwood's expression softened slightly. Your restraint and professionalism are commendable, Sergeant. They remind us all that the true measure of character lies not in how we treat those who can benefit us, but in how we respond when faced with disrespect or misunderstanding. From the back of the courtroom, Sir William, the silver-haired barrister who had attempted to intervene earlier, nodded in approval. Beside him sat a distinguished older woman who had been taking careful notes throughout the proceedings. The gold pin on her lapel identified her as a member of the Judicial Conduct Committee, suggesting that the day's events might have consequences beyond this single hearing. As Hargrove gathered his papers with unsteady hands, a junior clerk approached and whispered something that caused the judge's face to pale further. Though inaudible to most in the courtroom, those nearest could make out fragments about the Lord Chief Justice's office requesting a full transcript and immediate review. The generosity of this response, offering Hargrove a dignified interpretation of his actions rather than focusing on the personal nature of the attack, seemed to impress Justice Blackwood. "Well said, Sergeant. These proceedings are now concluded." As Sergeant Blackwell resumed his post at St. James's Palace that afternoon, tourists gathered as usual to observe the living symbol of Britain's traditions. Few of them could have guessed that the scarlet-uniformed figure, standing in disciplined silence, had, hours earlier, delivered a masterclass in legal reasoning that had humbled a High Court judge. Behind every uniform, whether judicial robes or a guardsman's tunic, stands a complete human being whose depths and capabilities cannot be judged by appearance alone. Sergeant Blackwell's story reminds us that respect for tradition means understanding its true purpose and substance, not merely its outward form. What would you have done in Blackwell's position? Would you have responded with the same composed dignity when faced with disrespect and false accusations? Or would you have been tempted to react more emotionally? If this story made you think about the danger of judging others by appearances, or the importance of maintaining composure when unfairly challenged, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about Royal Guards and the values they represent. Press the bell icon to never miss our uploads, and check out the other videos appearing on your screen right now. Have you ever been underestimated because of your uniform or profession? What unexpected skills or knowledge do you possess that might surprise those who judge you based on appearance alone? Share your experiences in the comments below. We read every one and would love to hear your thoughts.